Okay, this is our recording. This is our talk about, we'll call this uh, another discussion about the antecedents or the prior events to the U.S. Constitution. And we'll call this talk about the Declaration of Independence. This is, nothing fancy, I guess. It's like lemon and ginger, right? Lemon zinger, something like that. Lemon and ginger. All right, so what we said earlier, you'll watch the other recording to get it in detail, but what we said earlier is that a constitution is the core basic document that divides power in a state. We earlier said, following from Weber's analysis, is that a state is a specific type of political organization where the official institutions and society interact through the use of power. The state is a specific type of political organization. We said that politics is about power, and we said that power is the ability to manipulate choice, and the choices that matter are those that allocate scarce resources. So when you combine those two things together, you need the ability to divide who has what kind of power in your state, inside your country. And so the Constitution is the document that does that. It is the foundational bargain basement core document that divides power in the state. Now, instead of just walking right up into the Constitution, right? Like you just don't walk up to the Constitution and just start reading it like it's random book. I do have the Constitution sitting here open. But in order to get into the Constitution, what we wound up needing to do is read, or let's say, think about the antecedent documents, the events that occurred prior to the reading, the writing of the Constitution. In the earlier recording, I tried to put a little bit of energy into going through these antecedent events. And so at this recording, I want to talk about, please, the Declaration of Independence. Remember with me, please, that it is Thomas Paine who gets historic credit as being the father of the American Revolution. In 1776, Thomas Paine writes the famous pamphlet called Common Sense. In opining about the importance of Thomas Paine to the American Revolution, John Adams once said, without the pen of the author of Common Sense, the sword of Washington would have been raised in vain. So Thomas Paine is called the father of the American Revolution because he writes this pamphlet called Common Sense. And you'll remember Common Sense. Common Sense is somewhat famous. I think it's gotten into popular culture. And indeed, the whole notion of Winter Soldier has definitely gotten into uh, popular culture. But Thomas Paine, 1776, he said, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will in this crisis shrink from the service of his country, but he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, not like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, I believe that's what that says, the more glorious the triumph." And that type of rhetoric was used to inspire people to join the American Revolution. This is one of my more favored paintings of the American Revolution. This thing here is called Washington Crossing the Delaware. He is crossing the Delaware at a significant point in the American Revolution because Washington, as commanding general of the American Revolutionary Forces, they had been losing engagement after engagement, and it looked like this experiment in freedom was going to fall flat on American face. Now here you have, on a Christmas Eve, I believe, you have the American colonists or the Revolutionary Army traveling across the Delaware River to go engage, not necessarily British regulars, but to go engage the Hessian German mercenaries, the mercenaries called the Hessians, right? Fighting forces. And so I like to point this picture out. If we were in class, I'd have dramatically more fun with it than I'm about to do now. But look at how they are using sticks in their feet to push icebergs out the way. Look at how the sun is performing a halo over George Washington. Look at George Washington standing at a Masonic 90-degree set of 90-degree angles, strong, upright, resolute. Look at the American flag. This is one of my favorite pictures of the American Revolution there. All right. So by the time you have the Continental Congress meeting together in 1775, you have already had military conflict at Concord, military contact at Lexington. It became clear that you're not getting ready to have peace, so then you have to prepare for war. If you're going to prepare for war, you need soldiers. Who's going to lead this army? John Adams says, let's nominate George Washington. Remember, let me show you the picture, that George Washington had gained his military experience during the 7 Years' War that had occurred about a decade or so earlier. So John Adams says, let's make George Washington the head of the army. All right. So now you've got George Washington at the head of the army. And wait, don't look at this picture. This picture is something else, right? But instead of not along with that, then you need some people that are going to draft a set of reasons to determine why we're going to have this American Revolution. Right. And so we need somebody, so says the Continental Congress, we need someone who has diplomatic experience, someone who is familiar with the parliaments and elites and the governing structure and the women of Britain and France. Well, then that would mean we need Benjamin Franklin, the elder statesman, the diplomat extraordinaire. We need Benjamin Franklin to be involved in the writing of the Declaration of Independence. The Continental Congress says we need this Declaration of Independence to read like an indictment. We want to charge John King George King George with not just crimes, but we want to charge him with historic crimes. And so they say we need someone to write this document like it's a legal indictment, and then they get John Adams, the lawyer who had already distinguished himself in defending the British soldiers during the Boston Massacre. The Boston Massacre, which I talked about in the earlier recording, or the recording earlier. And then, along with the John Adams and Benjamin Franklin, they said we need to have this document sing. We don't want people to read this document just like it's just any old thing else, but they want this document to read with the weight of history. We need someone with in common language. We need someone who can write his butt off, who's going to put a certain amount of rhetorical flair in the Declaration of Independence, right? And so they wind up getting Thomas Jefferson because they knew that Thomas Jefferson knew how to write. So you've got a committee of people, right? There's someone else who I'm neglecting right now, but you had Benjamin Franklin, you had John Adams, you had Thomas Jefferson as the principal author, but then were they alone? They were not. Let me introduce you. I got my books out today. I like teaching with my books. Let me show you my reference points. I got some Howard Zinn on it for you, putting some Howard Zinn on it. This book on the bottom here is called Lies, My Teacher Told Me. But let me introduce you right now to the historian coming from my alma mater, Morehouse College, Lerone Bennett Jr. This book here, Before the Mayflower, as I get older and I think about the things that have, really impressed me, yeah, this is one of my favorite. I guess this might be my favorite book. I mean, this is actually one of my favorite books, right? And I'm gonna read liberally from it for today. Let me tell you a quick story. This is what you come to college for, not just to hear me read the book, but stories from your professor. You see the guy's name there, Lerone Bennett Jr. In the early 90s, I was at a street festival in Brooklyn, New York at Boys and Girls High School. And I looked at this individual and I was like, man, that looks like Lerone Bennett Jr. I was somewhat younger than I am now. And so I was like, oh man, I'm never going to see Lerone Bennett Jr. again. I should go and say hi to him because I've had this book since I was like in high school, you know what I mean? And so I was like, oh man, that's Lerone Bennett Jr. And I was like, nah, don't go. He's minding his business. Leave him alone. And so while I was debating whether or not I would go talk to him, I wound up stalking him. Like I was creeping behind him like I was some kind of weirdo, right? I was walking around and he was walking around minding his business, smoking his pipe. And eventually I tapped him on the shoulder and I was like, are you Dr. Bennett? And he looked me up and down, right? And he had I got a fork here, but he had a pipe in his hand, in his mouth. So he takes the pipe out and he looks me up and down and was like, hello, young man. And I was like, ah, LaRoe Bennett Jr., how you doing, man? I'm one of your students, even though you never met me. I came out of Morehouse College, da 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 da. So I want to say, and I'm so glad I did that because I was nervous to do it, but I never saw LaRoe Bennett Jr., at least with my physical eye. I never saw LaRoe Bennett Jr. again before in my life. Now, I'm bringing up LaRoe Bennett Jr. because we're talking about who was in the room during the writing of the Declaration of Independence. We already just said Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson being the principal author. But what we know here is that LaRoe Bennett Jr. had been attended to by an enslaved black man named Jupiter, derisively named Jupiter, for his whole life. That man's name comes down to us through history as Jupiter, like Fido and Skippy and Mutt and Spot, right? That's not the name of a person, Jupiter. Anyway, that always aggravates me. So Thomas Jefferson is attended to by Jupiter, and Jupiter, LaRoe Bennett Jr. muses, was very likely in the room when they wrote the Declaration of Independence. So not only the Declaration of Independence includes, as we'll see in a second, one of the most historically relevant, one of the most famous sentences, not just in American history, but in Western history, maybe even in world history. This notion that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And when he wrote that, he was likely being attended to by Jupiter, who was enslaved to him. The man then who wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident," was being attended to. He probably had Jupiter serving him sweet tea. Jupiter was probably rubbing Benjamin Franklin's 70-year-old feet while he was in there talking about, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Okay, so I wanted to make sure I pressed that point. Now, let's jump right into it and let's read the Declaration of Independence together. The Declaration of Independence, sponsored, I guess, by the Second Continental Congress, principally authored by Thomas Jefferson. It has in here a few things. I want you to be able to find social contract theory inside the Declaration of Independence. Now, write some notes. What's in the Declaration of Independence, right? We're going to read this document. I want you to treat it like a treasure hunt or something like that, right? You want to find social contract theory. I want you to find Hobbes and Locke inside the Declaration of Independence. And then we're going to find 4 target audiences of the Declaration of Independence. Without further ado, let's get into it, right? July 4th, 1776. Dun, dun, dun. Your declaration famously begins when, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which, and let's pause there. So this first line here is saying that every now and then it becomes necessary for people to change their government. Right? He says dissolve the political bands which have connected them. Every now and then people have to change their government. And then you see your declaration says assume among the powers of the earth. That means that people have a certain right to assert their equality amongst other people, and that should be worldwide. Now, let's be clear that we are 100 and some odd years deep into the slave trade. This is true, but this is the assertion of the Declaration of Independence. Now, Thomas Jefferson continues. He says, to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. Now, wait a minute. Which British philosopher did we earlier, last week, 2 weeks ago, see was engaged in the laws of nature? The laws of nature comes from the state of nature. Who talked about the state of nature? Not Joshua Locke yet, not Locke yet, but we're talking about Thomas. That's right, DePaz. We're talking DePaz. Doesn't paz mean peace? Ruby of peace? That means Hobbes. We're talking about Hobbes, right? Ruby of peace gets us with the Hobbes, and Zachowski. There you go, get it right. So we see immediately here then that Thomas Jefferson is dealing with Hobbes. Remember, Hobbes will have written 100 years prior to Thomas Jefferson writing the Declaration. That Hobbes, Jefferson would have studied Hobbes in college, right? And so you see his Hobbes here. Now you see here, he references nature's God. Thomas Jefferson is referencing nature's God. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to separation. He says, hey, we're getting ready to have a revolution here. And let me go ahead and explain to you why we're having this revolution. You see how it says decent respect to the opinions of mankind, right? Let me tell you why we're getting ready to have a big old revolution. Now, one more time. This is one of the most famous sentences in American history, Western history, maybe even in world history. Let me back up and let me show you another slide set. This is not, hold on, let me see if I can find it right quick, right? Because this is not, I didn't really emphasize this as much as I would have if we were doing it in class. But remember, I don't even know if I actually said it like this, but hold on, I can't even find it, right? But there's a slide where I have the pictures of Hobbes, Locke, Madison, Rousseau, and then Hofstadter. All right, let me give it up, right? Essentially, what I'm looking to, let me see if this is it right here, right? Uh, hold on. I know I interrupted the flow, but stick with me. Hang with me for a minute. Hold on. All right. I don't even know if I said this earlier, right? But in the first week of class, what I should have said was this whole notion of Enlightenment philosophy is important. That this stuff about, social contract theory and people having inalienable rights, this stuff not only led to the American Revolution, but it inspired the French Revolution. It inspired Dessalines to sign the Overture and Buchmann in the Haitian Revolution. And it also inspired the South Americans to organize themselves and to push back against the Spanish and the Portuguese. It inspired the revolutions of Simón Bolivar, right? And so this stuff is, generally important, right? And so this is a sentence that helped to inspire people around the world. Thomas Jefferson famously says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, and that amongst these are life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. Now, Thomas Jefferson here, remember, Lerone Bennett Jr. is telling us, yeah, but when he wrote that, he was being attended to by an enslaved African derisively named Jupiter. Yeah, that's true. We'll get to that in a second. But here we see Thomas Jefferson. I'm going to read something to you in a second. Here we see Thomas Jefferson saying that people have inalienable rights. What British philosopher in 1689 wrote this book called The Second Treatise on Government, where he gives us his principal contribution is inalienable rights? Y'all put a name in the chat box. Who said that there's inalienable rights? It's not Thomas Jefferson, because this would have happened a couple of generations, like 100 years before that, right? I see Benjamin and Fincher and Summer and Kelly and Rodriguez and Phelps and Iruka and Reynolds and Abdur Rahim talking about Locke, and that is right. So we haven't gotten deep inside the Declaration of Independence at all, and we already see the strains, rather the legacy of Thomas Hobbes, and we also see, importantly, the legacy of John Locke. Now let's go ahead and mess with some Locke, right? Here, Locke can be understood to be saying that people have are created equal, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. But maybe one day, I don't know, if you don't go to grad school for political science, maybe you'll never read it. So one day, maybe you'll get into, that second treatise on government, and you'll see that John Locke, he was like, yeah, equality, but he didn't really mean equality, right? Second treatise on government, Locke said, though I have said that all men are by nature equal, wait a minute, I cannot be supposed to understand all sorts of equality. So Locke is hedging his bets. He's equivocating on the notion of equality. So if Locke, the person who came up with the notion that all men are created equal, if Locke equivocates on equality, then maybe Jefferson and the founding fathers of the Constitution are equivocating on equality also. This thing says, behold, we who? Who's this we? truths to be self-evident that all men, really? Do you really mean to say all men, or do you not mean that enslaved Africans are understood as men? And that these people have life, liberty, and Jefferson here says the pursuit of happiness. Wait a minute. Locke didn't say anything about happiness. Locke said the right to hold private property. Why then does Thomas Jefferson flip this script here and talk about the pursuit of happiness? Well, remember with me that the Declaration of Independence, it wasn't emailed to everybody, it wasn't put in a PDF and sent around the country. No, in fact, there were only a few copies of the thing actually produced, and it was given to theater troops. Theater troops would get on in their, I don't know what you call it, horse-drawn stage, right? Whatever you call the thing that horses pull, a buggy or whatever, and the back of the thing would open up, and they would park that buggy in front of the local bars and the churches, but they'd park it in front of the bar. That makes it more funny in my example. And then they would ring a bell, and then people would come out of the bar with beers in their hand, right, drinks in their hand, and they would perform the Declaration of Independence. Any performance, any good performance, involves a certain amount of give and take with the audience. So muse with me, where you have the actors performing the Declaration of Independence, and people are saying, you know, they're endowed by their creator, and the people say, yeah, with certain inalienable rights, and the people say, you're damn right. And he said that amongst these are life. People say, yeah, I'll fight for my right to life and liberty. And people say, that's right, I'll fight for my liberty. And if Locke had said, and the right to hold private property, the people would have said, oh, wait a minute. Did you say right to hold property? Hey, John, you own any property? No, Samuel. Hey, Bill, do you own property? No, I don't, Bill. Hey, Roger, do you own property? So the question would have been, the question is, how do you get people to join your American Revolution if you're saying that you're fighting for the right to hold property when the people who you need to staff the military don't own a lick of property? So that's why he changed the phrase into the pursuit of happiness. That's getting ready to lead us into our first target audience. Remember, 4 target audiences of the Declaration of Independence, but we're not there yet. Let's keep going. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted amongst men, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed. Oh, wait a minute now. Put this in the chat box. What do you call it when the people are the source of power and the people give up some of that power and lend it to the government so that the government can protect their rights? Wait a minute, not social contract theory yet, not yet, but it starts with a P word, right? It's called popular something or other. It's a phrase that comes to us through Rousseau. That's right, Joshua, popular sovereignty. Joshua, Catherine Logan, Juliana Davis, Kyra Lovinsky, that's a grandiose name. Luvinsky, Tamaya, Cole, that's right, popular sovereignty. So remember, Rousseau says that popular sovereignty is used to describe that the people are the source of the power. The people give up some of their power and lend it to the government. The government uses that power to secure their rights. So the Declaration of Independence here is dealing not only with Hobbes, your declaration is not only dealing with Locke, but your declaration is also dealing with Rousseau. Let's make it plain. Your declaration concludes that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government. Really? Now we come to the earlier point. What do you call that relationship between the people and the state, between the elected and the electorate, right? Where the people say we create government to protect our rights, but if the government is violating instead of protecting our rights, then we can establish a new government. That is called social contract theory, and you got it right. Davis, Joshua, Martin, Constance, Mik, Mikhail Abdur Rahim, right? That's called social contract theory. So we haven't even really read the Declaration yet, and we find the notion of inalienable rights. We find the notions of state of nature and the laws of nature. And then we also very clearly see right here, and I mean right here, social contract theory. Now let's pick up the pace. We're getting ready to find, right? Remember to write this in your notes, 4 target audiences of the Declaration of Independence. I'm enjoying this. I like the Declaration. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established, can't find my cursor, right? Long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly, and this is one of my favorite lines in this thing, accordingly, all experience has shown that mankind is more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. Man, say that to yourself after we end this class. That's good stuff. Now, when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce them under absolute capital D despotism, right? Not despotism, but capital D despotism. It is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. So they're saying we have a right and a duty to engage the social contract and throw this government off to create a new government. Now, the first target audience, here's something for your notes. The first target audience of the Declaration of Independence are the American colonists. We see here that this phrase, instead of the right to hold property, the pursuit of happiness, is designed to speak to the American colonists. But let's go forward. Remember, we said that John Adams was part of this effort to write the Declaration because the Declaration they wanted it to read like an indictment. To indict means to charge. So they're charging the King George I can't remember if I should say the second or the third. They're indicting King George as being guilty of some things. They're saying he has done these things and these things are wrong. So the history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. He said, you want to hear it? Here it go. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. I'm not going to read every one of them, but just look at the general theme. He has refused. He has forbidden this. He has refused that. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant. He has dissolved our representative houses repeatedly. He has refused for a long time after such dissolutions to cause others to be elected. He has endeavored to prevent the population for that purpose, obstructing our laws. He has obstructed the administration of justice. He has made judges dependent on his will alone. He has now, remember, he has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and to eat out their substance. In the earlier discussion, I made point to show you this here, where they were so angry at those tax collectors that they were tarring and feathering those guys, tarring and feathering them in such a way that it actually made it into the, depictions of art. So this is where we say here, they're mad at those new offices that we're talking about, the tax collectors principally. More, he has kept among us in times of peace standing armies. He has effected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws. He has quartered large bodies of troops among us. He has protected these troops by mock trial from punishment from murders. He is cutting off our trade. He is imposing taxes on us without our consent. He is depriving us of the benefits of trial by jury. He is transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses. He has abolished this free system of English law. He has taken away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, altering fundamentally the forms of our government, suspending our legislatures, declaring themselves to be vested in the power to legislate for us. He has abdicated our government. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, destroyed the lives of our people. He has constrained our fellow citizens, transporting armies, large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages and totally unworthy of the head of a civilized civilized nation, Thomas Jefferson was laying it on. He has excited domestic insurrection among us, right? And then now here, why did Jefferson have to say this? He has excited domestic insurrection among us and endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages and sexes and conditions. Who did he sick on them? You sick the Indians on us. And what are those Indians? They said, Thomas Jefferson's words, merciless Indian savages. Why do you have to say it like that? Why do they have to be savages, Thomas Jefferson, right? Why do they have to be? Well, remember, we're always talking about this stuff, acknowledging the intersection of race, right? Well, I'm trying not to get too carried away, but I got some stuff for you on that Declaration of Independence, but that's not really where we're going here. I'm just giving this to you as an overview. So what we just said is that the Declaration of Independence has as a first target audience the American colonists. Why do you want to talk to the American colonists? Because you need them to fight. They're going to be the ones that staff the military. Second target audience coming up. Your declaration says, after this long indictment that it has laid out on King George, every stage of these oppressions we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. However, our repeated petitions have only been answered by repeated injury. Right? So who are you petitioning? You are petitioning the legislators, the members of parliament. You're petitioning the elites or the aristocracy. The second target audience, then, for your notes, the second target audience of the Declaration of Independence is the British government or the British Parliament or the British elites. I don't really care what word you use. The aristocracy. We're talking about the decision makers. Remember, when you read the history, what we covered in the earlier talk that I just did, right, is you have the economic impositions that the British were laying on the American colonists to recoup the debt that they incurred during the 7 Years' War. Well, to respond to this activity, you have Benjamin Franklin actually goes to petition the British Parliament, right? And so you have this Benjamin Franklin goes and makes an argument that is somewhat successful, and he's able to push back on them. However, they don't, he's not completely successful. So the American colonists still had reason to be upset. And so he says, we have petitioned for redress. Remember your First Amendment. He is saying here that we sent Benjamin Franklin over there to talk to you guys, but you have not been listening. That's the second target audience. Now, the third target audience, your declaration. Nor have we been wanting in attentions to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us, right? We've been trying to tell you. We've reminded them of the circumstances of our immigration and settlement here. Hey, most of us, at least the elites, we come from Britain. You are British. We are essentially have a British lineage. We, meaning the American colonists, have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, saying, what's happening to us is just not right. We have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations. Like, look, we have cousins that are British and we might be American, but we've got family members that are British. We don't want to have this fight. In order for us to not have this fight, please control your parliament, check your parliament, get the parliament to stop doing these things to us, right? However, your declaration says they too, the British people, have been deaf to the voice of justice and consanguinity. The third target audience of the Declaration of Independence are the British people. Write that, please, in your notes. The British people. Why do you need to talk to the British people? You're talking to them because they are the ones that are going to staff the army, right? They know that we're going to fight. We're going to be fighting the British people. We're not going to be fighting the British Parliament day to day. Musket to musket. We're going to be fighting the British people. So they too have been deaf to the voice of justice and consanguinity. So we must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation and hold them, as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, and in peace, friends. Yeah, that's tough. Very tough talking, right? Now, the fourth target audience is found in the literal Declaration of Independence, the literal declaration, right? You see here that your declaration says, appealing to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, God, in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. Bum, 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 bum. That is the Declaration of Independence. Can't you just see the bombs bursting in air, right? Now, the fourth target audience, they are, these states, are absolved from all allegiance to the British crown, and all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. And that as free and independent states, they, meaning the states, have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. The fourth target audience, then, let's use this phrase, is the international community. The international community. You have your Declaration of Independence in the writing rather of Thomas Jefferson, essentially saying, "Hey, the United States is open for business. B. We're open for business." Prior to the Declaration of Independence or prior to the American Revolution, if you were in Paris and you wanted to engage an economic contract with Boston, you had to go through London. Now you have your Declaration of Independence proclaiming to the world, hey, if you're in Brisbane or if you're in, Paris, or if you're in Madrid, it doesn't matter, you don't have to go through London anymore. If you're in Madrid and you want to engage a contract with, let's say, Philadelphia, you can go straight to Philadelphia. No need to stop over and ask London for permission. So the fourth target audience. All right, and that concludes my read of the Declaration of Independence. I wanted you to see is I wanted you to see Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau in the Declaration. I wanted you to see inalienable rights and social contract theory, and then also I wanted us to locate the Declaration in the Declaration for target audiences. All right, now that's enough. I'm gonna stop. Hold on, I'm gonna stop the recording as soon as it acknowledges me hitting the button.